Welcome to Radical Responsibility, the podcast dedicated to ridding the world of blame and shame, where we explore the issues you care about from a unique perspective. 100% ownership for each and every circumstance we face in life, day in and day out. Hi, welcome to the Radical Responsibility podcast. This is Fleet Mall, your host, and today I'm having a conversation with my friend and colleague, the renowned Dick Schwartz, Richard Schwartz, the developer of the family systems, internal family systems model, or IFS, an extraordinary psychologist and psychotherapist who has really revolutionized the world of psychotherapy. IFS, internal family systems, is really one of the predominant models of psychotherapy practiced in the world today. And it does such a beautiful job of going into our inner landscape in an empowering and healing way. His most recent book is called No Bad Parts. Those of you familiar with the internal family system, it recognizes, like most modern therapies, psychotherapies, that the idea of a unitary I, a unitary self, is actually a myth, that we're made up of many, many, many parts. And in his book, No Bad Parts, he takes a completely shame-free approach to healing all those parts, and not only that, giving us access to what he calls self with a capital S, which is a greater space beyond all those parts, which all the spiritual traditions have been pointing towards. So, Dr. Dick Schwartz.
I'm really thrilled to be here today with friend and colleague Dick Schwartz. How are you, Dr. Schwartz?
As you know, you can call me Dick, Fleet. And it's always great talking to you. I really enjoy our relationship.
Yeah, me too. Me too, absolutely. And it's I actually really treasure it. And we've really been looking forward to this conversation. And I'm going to first share a bit of your bio for those who are not as familiar with your work. And then we'll jump right into the conversation. So Dr. Richard Schwartz, or Richard Schwartz, PhD, is a systemic family therapist, academic, and founder of the Internal Family Systems Model, or IFS. In response to clients' descriptions of various parts within themselves, he developed IFS, which is an evidence-based and widely used form of psychotherapy, used particularly with trauma. It provides a non-pathologizing, optimistic, and empowering perspective and an effective set of techniques for working with individuals, couples, families, corporations, and classrooms. Dr. Schwartz is on the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He is the founder of the Center for Self-Leadership, which offers professional and public training. Dr. Schwartz has published over 50 articles about IFS and is the author of best-selling books such as No Bad Parts. He is a highly sought-after speaker for both public events and national professional organizations. You know, you're best known for internal family systems, obviously, and I definitely want to explore that today and explore the potential it has for integrating with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. But I wonder if first you could just share a little bit about how your interest in this emerging field of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, or psychedelics in general, emerged. And, just how you feel about, it's taking place in the context of this overall kind of what's being called the psychedelic renaissance. So there's a lot going on, and it's pretty fast-moving. I'm just curious about your involvement with that, and before we jump into the IFS in particular.
Yeah, so probably like you, I'm a child of the 60s, and I, like everybody back then, did my share of psychedelics, and had some amazing journeys, and then had a really bad trip that made me stop doing it at all. And also alerted me to the danger of doing it both without being really careful about the substance, and also without careful attention to set and setting and who's with you. And then I didn't have anything to do with psychedelics until recently, when actually a guy named Phil Wolfson got interested in IFS and proposed that we co-lead a retreat on IFS and ketamine. And I felt like, we do pretty well without psychedelics. So I'm not sure that this is something I'm going to really pursue in a big way, but I was happy to give it a try because we do get stuck, and maybe this would jar people loose from when they get stuck. And so then went ahead and did that first retreat with him. Can't remember how long ago, but it's over a year. And was amazed at the combination, really. Just amazed by the combination. So subsequently, I think I've done 2 or 3 other ketamine and IFS retreats and remain amazed and plan to keep doing 1 or 2 a year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know there are other therapists and clinicians in the kind of IFS network that are also involved in the field, like the Mithoffers and many others. So I imagine this is going to be an ongoing exploration. Well, let's talk specifically then about IFS. I wonder if you could give us I realize it's a complex, well, simple and complex, but it's a broad topic. But maybe if you could give us the thumbnail version of what IFS is actually, and maybe something about the taxonomy of the parts and especially this emerging possibility of connecting with this emerging self with a capital S, becoming more self-led and things like that in one's life.
Yeah, I'll try to condense it. So I'm trained as a family therapist. I have a PhD in that, and I thought family therapy was the bomb, and did an outcome study in the early 80s and found it didn't work with the population I was working with. And out of frustration, started asking these bulimic kids why, and they started talking this language of parts. And as I explored that, initially with fear, because I thought maybe they're sicker than I thought, but ultimately got curious about the phenomena and was lucky in the sense that I didn't have any training in psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy. And so I really had to listen carefully to what my clients were saying. And as I did that, I learned that parts aren't the product of trauma, which is one of the ways they've been seen in the what's called the DID world, the multiple personality disorder world, where the unitary mind was blown apart by trauma. And these are all what are called alters or fragments of that. What I was learning was that the parts pre-existed the trauma, that actually clients came into the world with them, and that they're all valuable. One of my recent books was titled No Bad Parts, that there's nothing in there that inherently is negative or evil, but that trauma or attachment injuries or bad parenting or, being rejected over and over or abandoned and so on as a child forces these parts out of their naturally valuable states into roles that they don't actually like most of the time, but they think are necessary to keep you going. And trauma is also sort of frees them in time during the trauma. So many of these parts think you're still quite young and think they have to protect you in the way they did back then. And the trauma also infuses them with what we call burdens, which are extreme beliefs and emotions that entered your system during the trauma and attach to the parts, almost like a virus, and drive the way the parts operate. So as I was getting that, it really shifted everything. It really shifted my whole paradigm for understanding people. But it also shifted the way I tried to get clients to relate to these parts, from trying to fight with them or ignore them to being compassionate for them and listening to them and getting to know why they do what they do. And in doing that, as a systems thinker, you mentioned a taxonomy. And so I began to explore the distinctions among them and how they operated as a system, patterns. And the big distinction that leaped out immediately and has held up as the big distinction all these years is between parts of us that before they were hurt would in other systems we call these inner children that are not only young, but they're also playful and joyful and give us a lot of creativity and adventurous and so on. But when they do get hurt or terrified or shamed, they take on those burdens. They now carry all this shame or terror or pain. And now they have the power to overwhelm us with it. If they get triggered, they can make us feel all that again and take us back into those scenes where they're stuck. And we think they're just emotions and memories that came from our traumas. And we have been taught in our culture and everybody around us, and there's a kind of natural impulse to just leave that in the past and just move on and don't look back. And so we tend to lock all that up, not realizing that in what I call exiling those parts of us, we're getting cut off from our juice, from our most valuable assets in some ways, simply because they got hurt. So for these, what I call exiles, it's insult to injury. The injury was the trauma, and the insult is they're abandoned by us. And so they're hurt even more by that. And so we've got this pool of pain and shame and terror most of us walk around with, trying our best to stay one step ahead of. And to stay one step ahead and to really not, to keep all that exile, other parts are forced out of their naturally valuable states to become protectors, some of whom protect us by managing the outside world so that nothing happens that triggers those exiles. And so we call them managers, and they tend to either maybe keep us in our heads so we don't feel much in our bodies, or they're kind of scanning for danger all the time and giving us input or taking over panic attacks, or they're trying to make us look perfect so we don't get rejected, or get us to achieve a high level so we get accolades to counter the worthlessness, or take care of everybody but don't take care of ourselves so everybody depends on us. So there's a whole bunch of common manager roles, all of which have in common the desire to control the outside world and to please people, and to, in doing that, keep these exiles from getting triggered, keep them contained and protected. And that works a lot of the time, but when it doesn't, there's this big explosion of flames of exiled emotion that threaten to consume us. And so we also have a set of parts who are on guard for that. And whenever that happens, will impulsively take us away, either get us higher than the flames or douse them with some substance or distract us until they burn themselves out. And so we call those firefighter protectors. So most of us walk around with that sort of assembly inside, and depending on circumstances and habits, one set of protectors or another is running our lives. And that's how we get diagnosed if we have problems. It's really, the diagnosis is just a description of the cluster of protectors that are driving us. So that's the map to the territory. Very simple. Exiles and protectors. One class of protector are managers, the other class is firefighter. In addition, and this is the big discovery, for lack of a better word, of IFS, is if all of those parts were to open space inside, out would pop a different person who has what we call the 8 C's qualities. So if I were working with you, Fleet, and I was having you work with your critic maybe and a part that didn't like the critic, and you had this big fight going on, and I asked them both to just relax for a second and open space inside. And now how do you feel toward them? Or how do you feel toward the critic, for example? You would say, seconds earlier you hated it, but now you would say, I'm just kind of curious about why it calls me names.
Mm-hmm.
And you would say it from a place of calm, confidence, even compassion at that point. And again, it would be like a totally different person. It emerged spontaneously, simply by getting the other part to give us some space. And then if I had you talk to your critic, the conversation would go in a much different and better way, because the critic wouldn't feel so attacked and could reveal its secret history about why it got into this role and what it's trying to protect you inside of you. And you would open your heart even more as you listen to it. And you could even honor it for its service as it tried to protect, even if it was totally misguided and it screwed up your life. And then it could reveal what it protects. And then we would get permission to go to that and get whatever parts are stuck in the past out of there and help them unburden. And then the critic could even totally transform. So, and when I would ask clients after this other person popped out, what part of you is that? They would say, that's not a part like these others. That's me. That's myself. So I came to call that the self with a capital S. And now 40 years later, turns out that self is in everybody, can't be damaged, just beneath the surface of the parts. So when they open space, it emerges spontaneously and knows how to heal internally, knows how to heal external relationships. And that's the big deal about IFS, that we can access that place in people so quickly. You don't have to meditate 20 years to get to it.
So for people who maybe are less familiar with IFS, I mean, most of us were educated and cultivated into the idea of a unitary self. I'm just this one personality. And we have a sense of our strengths and weaknesses and proclivities and so forth. But for the kind of uninitiated person, let's say, what might be the parts they most might be readily aware of? Like, in fact, probably we've all at one point or another said, well, part of me wants to do this and part of me wants that. We've probably all said that at one time or another.
Yeah, I mean, people, and I said that before I ran into the phenomena, because it's an easy word, it's the word I use for them, even though it doesn't do justice to their full range personalities. It sounds like some kind of machine part, but it's the most common parlance. And so people, if I say, tell me about the part of you that does this, Fleet, you're not going to say, what do you mean part? But if I said, tell me about the subpersonality that does this, you'd say, what are you talking about? So I can engage people in the language easily if I use that word. And forget the rest of your question.
Well, I just would give, people.
Oh, yeah, an example. Yeah.
An example of parts that we're kind of all aware of that are just under the surface, even when we're functional, there's just.
Well, I haven't met many people who don't have a critic, for example. That was the example I was giving you earlier. And hate it, or actually, I once did a workshop for a bunch of CEOs, and in the workshops, I'll say, how many of you have a critic, and can you go inside and get to know it, and how do you feel toward it? And most people say, I don't like it, it drives me crazy, or I'm afraid of it. These people, I depend on it, I need it, I don't want to get rid of it because it drives me. I have to keep working constantly. So anyway, most people can identify with a critic. Most people, as you said, can think of a time when they're in a dilemma and there is a part arguing very openly one way and another part that's fighting with it inside, and they can notice there are these different voices in there. Because a lot of times you just don't notice them because they're just kind of doing it behind the scenes, and it's only when they really stand out, like if there's some trigger, that you can really identify them clearly.
So most of us, if we're relatively functional in life, and that's a kind of a broad categorization, because some of what we have to do to function in modern society probably means we're being operated by self-critics and all kinds of things. But if we're relatively functional, Are we basically what's running our life mostly? Is it some maybe there's some of S with self with a capital S? Maybe there's some there if we've done a little work, but it's mainly manager parts that are kind of managing our lives.
Exactly right. What's called the ego is generally a collection of little managers who often can do pretty well. You know, they're pretty smart, even though they're often young, and they tend to be hard workers, and yeah, so and they do their best. You know, they're in the family therapy world. There was a concept of parentified children, and that applies to this inner family too. That these managers, if you get to know them, often are much younger than the role they've been forced into.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't know a lot of the time that there is this other self in there that could do a much better job and is much older than them. And they think, again, often because they had to take over when you were young, that they need to keep doing that.
Well, let's explore integrating this model with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So it would seem that there's some similarities in the model in that they're both somewhat insight-based, and that insights into this landscape can be liberating. People have insights under psychedelics that they find liberating, and what you're describing, people would have insights into, or the parts would have insights about each other, and the self has. And then there also seems to be both seem to have this possibility of what you're calling the self with a capital S emerging, this kind of wiser, more quantumous, sometimes more courageous, less stuck part. Seems so, or maybe it's not a part, but this part of our, it's hard not to say part, that this seems to emerge out of both those models. And so I'm wondering how you see that working together.
Yeah. So again, with my limited experience, I have considerable experience now with ketamine, but less with other psychedelics. But at this point, generalization would be that for whatever reason, the medicine puts the managers we were just talking about, that ego, to sleep or offline for some reason. And when in the psychedelics world, they call it ego death or ego dissolution, which terrifies these managers. They don't want to die. Mm-hmm. So it's I'm trying to get the field to let go of that phrase. But for whatever reason, they go offline. And when they do, spontaneously, a lot of self comes forward. And that's a big invitation for a lot of other parts who haven't had access to come and get attention. And so people, it's more than insight, because you can get a lot of insight from your thinking part, but you wind up going to these places that you've stayed away from most of your life. And you wind up listening to what parts need to be witnessed, those parts that you locked up need you to know about what happened to them and how bad it was. And that does help you understand your life more. But even more importantly for me, you wind up taking those parts out of where they're frozen in time and helping them transform. And you mentioned Michael and Annie Mithoff earlier, and they are IFS therapists. And so they were running, especially the early days, the MAPS trainings with MDMA. And they kept track of how often spontaneously people would start doing IFS without any guidance from them, without any coaching, simply by taking the MDMA. And they found with high dose MDMA was like 80% would just start doing it, start healing themselves that way, which was very validating to me, because it confirmed that I had just stumbled onto a phenomena that people know how to do when they access enough self. And so So that's my thinking about it, that we do have this healing ability inside of us, and the medicine just opens that up because it's usually blocked by these parts that think they have to manage our lives so rigidly often and don't give us enough access.
Mm-hmm. It seems like in general, the therapeutic landscape, there's so many different models, but they share in common some sense of trying to unfreeze that landscape. A lot of the childhood experiences and childhood traumas allow those to resurface, and ideally resurface or be re-experienced in a way that's not re-traumatizing. So the safety of a therapeutic relationship, or it seems like some of these processes, maybe in IFS, the emergence of more access to self, as well as what happens in the psychedelic experiences, you almost internally have now created that therapeutic environment that allows you to re-witness these things and learn from them or heal from them without being re-traumatized. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So with many other trauma therapies, there's a huge fear of what you're calling re-traumatizing the client, of what's called exceeding the window of tolerance of whatever the emotions are that the traumatized parts are feeling. And so there's this tremendous fear of the overwhelm. And so there's a lot of activity in preparation of going to these places to help people feel very grounded and connected to the therapist. And then as they do it, there's a careful monitoring of the amount of affect. And if it exceeds that window of tolerance, a shift away from it and into the grounding techniques. And what I found before psychedelics, but has been accentuated by psychedelics, is the difference with IFS is we're going to these places from what I call self. So you're bringing all these C-word qualities. I mentioned 4, and there's another 4. So they're the 8 C's. So courage, creativity, clarity, and connectedness, in addition to the calm, compassion, curiosity, and confidence. So you're already in that state before you start doing the work or before you take the medicine. And as you approach these exiles, if you open these doors to these basements that you've been staying away from your whole life, you don't get overwhelmed. Even as you approach all this huge affect, you'll feel it, you'll look like you're in it, maybe for a period of time. But if I were to ask you, Fleet, is this okay or is this too much? You'd say, no, it's okay, I can handle it. So I don't really have to worry at that point about this window of tolerance issue, mainly because we're bringing self to the pain.
Well, self, in a sense, is this self with capital S is almost also therapist with a capital T.
It is
able to hold that therapeutic space, almost in a kind of self-therapy, even if it's being aided by someone who's facilitating it.
Yes, the self is an inner therapist or an inner parent or inner healer or inner good leader. It can be all of those, and which doesn't minimize the need for the facilitator to be in self, because self is contagious. So if while you're with someone, you can get your parts to open a lot of space and you can be in this very spacious, kind of grounded place where you've got those 8 C's going for you, your client will sense the safety in that. So that's the set part of set and setting. Your client will feel this loving energy surrounding them. And that also helps their protectors open more and more space. So yeah, and parts are contagious too. So if, as a facilitator, I'm with somebody and they start to get very emotional and I get scared because I'm scared of my own exile, and the protector comes in, my client's going to sense that immediately, and that'll trigger their protectors and it'll shut it all down.
Mm-hmm.
So the state of the facilitator is really, really important too. And that's what I'm trying to bring also. The other thing I'll say about all that is what we found in these ketamine retreats is the importance of, in the prep sessions before the medicine, going to the protector parts who aren't so sure about doing this, or even have a lot of fear about doing it, and listening to all the fears and addressing those fears. So it doesn't help to just listen to the fears, but we have to say, I get that. I understand why you're afraid of that, but this is how we can handle that. And we can handle it. So that C word, confidence. And would you give us permission now to do it? And so we don't have people take the medicine until we get permission from their protectors. The veterans who've been doing this for a while have noticed the difference in the sort of volatility of the journeys people have, simply because we get all this permission going into it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would seem without that, there could still be a lot of different forms of manager parts, controlling parts, protector parts getting in there, and not letting the thing unfold.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the role of the therapist in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So I watched a lot of films from the clinical trials and so forth, and it seems, at least in that context, in fact, they're often called sitters. So it's a clinician, a researcher, sometimes physicians, sometimes psychotherapists, psychologists, and they're the sitters. And they're basically holding a safe space. And, they may rest a hand on someone or, but they're basically trying to hold a reassuring, safe, nurturing space, but they're not really actively doing therapeutic interventions, at least what I've seen so far. And I know there's several camps within the movement. Some really err on the side of just trust the medicine, let the medicine do the work. It doesn't require any intervention. But you were just mentioning there's what can be done before the session. And of course, there's integration work after the session. But and I'd like you to address both of those. But I'm wondering also about and whether you've had experience with this on these ketamine retreats, of any kind of facilitation during the session, or any therapeutic intervention or guidance during the session, or I know mostly music is used. So is it best just to let the person have their experience and have the therapy be pre and post, or do you see other possibilities of further integration?
Yeah, well, in talking to Michael and Annie Mithofer, they were constrained by what the requirements of the government to give them approval to do the research in terms of what they would allow during the sessions. So they couldn't do IFS, active IFS. They could after the person started to access a part, and they did at times, but that's why you see such a passive kind of sitter. Yeah, so when we're doing it, the ketamine is interesting and different in the sense from MDMA, in the sense that with moderate dose, medium dose, you actually leave your body and you're not available. If I wanted to work with somebody, I couldn't for a period of time. And often it's maybe 20 minutes. But it's when they come back into their bodies that there's so much self available. And it's during that after period of maybe an hour, you can do an enormous amount of healing very quickly. Other medicines don't make you leave, so you can actively work while the medicine's in effect, like with MDMA. And again, you have a lot more access to exiled parts and to self, and the healing happens much more quickly because the protectors, for whatever reason, often in regular IFS sessions, they're jumping in at times, and you got to stop and get them to step out. but I think you access so much self that all these young protectors say, wow, there's an adult here. We can just get out of the way. And then they start to do big healing, which is part of why I'm excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Even talking about, you know, specific parts that become traumatized and then further exiled, adding insult to injury and so forth. And we could, there could be an unending complexity to all these parts, and parts can have parts, and it could be a complex system. I'm wondering how this addresses, what people think of as a broader based, generally, I think, as a broader based collection of symptomology, like anxiety. They're experiencing anxiety. A lot of things make them anxious. They're physically anxious. It makes it difficult to leave home or engage socially, or people that are experiencing depression, and they just, they feel like they're trying to move through mud, right? They're just, in this. So these seem to be broader states. And I'm no doubt they have roots and underlying traumas and so forth. But I wonder how both IFS and possibly IFS and some kind of psychedelic assisted therapy address these kind of broader conditions.
Yeah, so having worked with people with both those diagnoses a lot, you do see common patterns. And we'll take anxiety first. So anxiety, there's usually a very, very scared, exiled part, because early on you saw in your life, or your family told you, that anxious part that got scared in some trauma, maybe, that you need to get away from it. You need to do things in spite of it. And to do that, you tend to have to exile it. And then once you do that, then you have a bunch of parts that are terrified of being triggered again, terrified of the anxiety attack and the disabling that comes with that. And so there are a bunch of protectors who either sort of shrink your life so that you're not in context that might trigger that one, or shame you constantly for being so scared and push you to try and overcome your anxiety and do things that ordinarily you're afraid of. And there's these battles going inside about whether that's safe or not. And so again, this is a totally different paradigm for understanding anxiety. It's not just a ball of fear that you have to overcome. It's a hurting inner sacred being who needs your love, who you've abandoned. And so when I'm working with an anxious person, I'm first working with all these protectors to get permission to actually go to the exile that's so full of fear. And so we're going to the fear rather than finding ways to better cope with it or avoid it. And most of psychiatry and psychology is designed to either medicate it into oblivion, or find better strategies for managing it, mm-hmm. instead of healing it. Mm-hmm. Healing involves going to it. And I can say something very similar about depression. With depression, there's usually an exile that carries a variety of feelings of pain or sadness or hopelessness or worthlessness. And then there are parts that, to avoid it, make you very flat and not, so you don't feel much. Mm-hmm. And that's depressing, to not feel much in life, and to not care, and to not try, and to stay in bed, and and so again, we go to those parts first and get permission, honor them for trying to keep you safe, and then get permission to go to the parts that are driving, or that they're trying to keep you from being overwhelmed by, and heal those parts.
So, I think one could think of internal family systems, as another conceptual model for describing all kinds of psychodynamics that happen within our personalities and so forth. And when I listen to you describe it, and I've read your book, you come closer to describing these almost as metaphysical realities. And whether someone bought into that or not, it seems one of the important thing is that you, because you regard them that way, you regard them with a lot more respect and love and caring, and you seem to take on the role of a good, healthy parent, of really caring for, nurturing, and respecting these, whatever you want to call them, entities, subparts, subpersonalities, but because you relate to them that way, it seems like you're bringing in a whole nother level of respect and care and love, really.
Yeah, I'm at a point now. Originally, I thought, oh, this is a really good metaphor to help people relate inside differently. But over time, the metaphor model didn't work, and I had to really acknowledge that these things are real. There is this real other world inside of us that we ignore most of the time, but deserves a lot of attention. And I don't impose that framework on students or people that are, especially people starting out, because it's so foreign to the ordinary paradigm. But my position is pretty pragmatic, that if you relate to them as if they were real, it works. We have lots of outcome data that show that it works better than most anything else with things like PTSD and depression and so on. So from the practical standpoint, why not buy into it, even if it's pretend for a while, and start relating to these things in this very different, much more compassionate and curious way. And then you find that it actually does make for a lot of transformation.
So in terms of the emerging self with a capital S that has these 8 qualities, the 8 C's that you spoke of, and is able to do this, naturally do this capacity for healing and positive parenting and healing and so forth, and holding space. I'm curious, does that sense of self with a capital S, is it still tied to a separate sense of self, like being separate from others, being separate from the world? And is there another, because the many spiritual traditions talk about going beyond, at least temporarily, or having experiences that are beyond any kind of separate self, and then you experience a profound sense of interconnectedness or a larger consciousness. So I'm wondering how that plays here in terms of one's relationship with the larger world. And
I'm glad you asked that, Fleet, because the other reason I'm so excited about psychedelics is that it does open a portal to this sense of we're so much more than what we're aware of in our bodies. And so and it isn't just through psychedelics. I'd gotten this before it, but my conception for self isn't that it's isolated in our bodies. It's separate from everybody else. In fact, as you do psychedelics or you meditate in a deep way, you really get a sense of what I call the particle physics. In physics, quantum physics, there's this concept of photons being both a particle and a wave.
mm-hmm.
And that, for me, what we experience as self and what we can access and help to heal is the particleization of the big self, which people could call God or the non-dual, and that when people take the medicine, particularly ketamine, and I think psilocybin also to a lesser degree, or maybe the same degree, I don't know. They in the higher doses, they go into that non-dual and they don't feel separate at all. They actually feel the connection to everything. And I've had that experience with ketamine. And it's a profound experience to feel, and it stuck with me in the sense that I now do believe that the self in me is not only connected, but is part of that big self. Mm-hmm. And that from that place, I do feel much more connected to everybody and to the earth. And so connectedness is one of those C words. So the more you access self, the more you see that you're not an isolated individual. And the more you also have this sense of there being so much more that helps you navigate this world. And I think that's why psychedelics are being used now with end of life, people who are at the end of their lives, because they really get a sense of it's just a transition and it's not something to be feared.
So I realize with this question, going a little bit beyond the landscape or the language of what's currently considered evidence-based, but if you don't mind venturing there, I know I've heard you speak about through having greater access to self, we get access to various forms of wisdom, inner guidance. And it's not uncommon that with plant medicine and other psychedelic experiences, people get in touch with what they regard as entities or beings or guides or allies and these kind of things. This is throughout the shamanic literature and the psychedelic literature and so forth. You know, in some ways, are these just more parts? Are these just more parts, or is there a difference? Or
Yeah. So I started running into the guide phenomena long before psychedelics with clients. I would be working with somebody, and they might have done some big piece of work, and they're feeling good about it, and all of a sudden they would get this voice of support and how great it was they could do that, and that voice would start to point toward other things and might even come in and help in some ways. And at first I thought, oh, that's great, there's a kind of cheerleader part that's come in. But as I had clients get curious about it, these things would say they're not parts like the others. They're there to help, and that they have been waiting for access to the client to give them this wisdom and support, but they're not parts. They're something else. And at that time, I wasn't a particularly spiritual person. I didn't have a framework for any of that. But then I did hear about shamanic kinds of traditions, and you do see that centuries or thousands of years people have been working with this phenomenon. And so I got more and more curious about it. And now I'd say 50% of my clients have ongoing relationships with these guides. We call them guides. And they're very, very helpful. And in the ketamine IFS workshops, it's not uncommon that they just show up spontaneously. And that's the other thing I'm excited about. It opens a portal to that kind of wisdom that we haven't had access to, because our parts and their burdens keep us from accessing those guides. And the guides will say they're dying to help us. They just can't get through. And so when we unburden to the point where they do have access, they're thrilled. And it's not like you got to pray to them and thank them, and they're just very eager to be here and to help us, not only individually, but they really want to help heal the planet. And so that's part of what excites me about the whole psychedelics revolution also.
So in terms of as these psychedelic therapies are coming online right now, ketamine is the only one that's legal nationally. I guess I'm not sure what's going on in Oregon with psilocybin, but we may see MDMA or psilocybin be rescheduled in this year or next year. And in terms of the possibilities of further integrating that with internal family systems, is there any research going on, or do you see the possibility of some research, or what's kind of happening there?
I am aware of a couple projects, both with psilocybin and end of life.
Mm-hmm.
A couple people have gotten grants to study that with IFS,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure where things stand in terms of the research, but I'm very excited that this is happening.
Mm-hmm. And there's been quite a lot of research done on IFS. It has been established in SAMHSA as an evidence-based therapeutic model.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I don't know how many studies we have now, but yeah, we're called evidence-based, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. So, so it seemed like it would be a natural continuation for that kind of research to continue, hopefully, for that to get funded. Do you have any concerns about this field of psychedelic medicine and where it's going, and in terms of safety, ethics, accessibility, different things?
I have concerns about all of that, and in general, I'm not a big proponent of a huge amount of regulation, but I do think there's the potential that it's all going to backlash, and we're going to be, there was this kind of heyday back in those, I guess it was the 60s mainly.
Mm-hmm.
There was research on psychedelics all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And then Nixon and the war on drugs and all of that just shut it all down. But partly it was shut down because so many people were having bad trips.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that danger if, I don't think it's a good idea for people to do it as a party thing. And I do think it needs to be, and that, there are people who have questionable ethics who are using it and have been busted for that, for exploiting people when they were on the medicines. And so the basic thing I'm trying to say is, if we don't have some degree of regulation, it's going to be, this big opportunity is going to be lost. So I really am supporting people who are pushing for that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to control what's going on in a larger kind of underground psychedelic movement. Although there's a lot of wonderful nonprofits trying to support people today. I don't think there were any nonprofits around when you and I were doing it back in the 60s that were out there to help you with your psychedelic experience. But there's a lot of that going on now. So perhaps that'll help with that movement. Seems to be a lot of thoughtful people involved in that. But it would seem like the training of the therapist is really, in terms of that part of it, that the psychedelic assisted therapy, the training of the therapist is really critical. And I think that's an age-old issue in the world of psychology and therapy and clinical practice. How much therapy does a therapist or a clinician or psychologist need to have done? And you can be a licensed clinical psychologist and never have done any inner work on yourself at all. And it seems like how you're describing the potential of the work with internal family systems for oneself, that would almost be at least one ideal training for people to be able to be therapists and support others from their, having a lot of access to their self with a capital S, with those 8C qualities and so forth, that could do a lot to avoid a lot of harm.
That's exactly right. And that's been our focus in training therapists in general, not just psychedelic therapists, but the effectiveness and also the lack of doing harm is so related to how much personal work people who have done with this. And I think part of the danger with the psychedelics is that, I don't want to be too overgeneralizing, but a lot of people attracted to being in the psychedelics world and also being facilitators have looser boundaries and less training to shore up those boundaries than in general. And so I do feel like there's a big need for very intense and well-designed training programs. And we run a training for IFS psychedelics. We've run a couple versions of those level 2 trainings, and I'm trying to support other programs that are doing similar things. I think MAPS has done overall a good job with it, although they even had a scandal of some kind. So yeah, it's very touchy right now. This is a point at which things could go either way.
Yeah, and one of the things about psychedelics is that both on the therapist side and the client side, or you get this very quick access. You take a substance and you get quick access to realms that might take quite a lot of individual effort to get there through meditation or breath work or therapy or other things, more dedication, more effort. But with a psychedelic, you take the substance and boom, you're there. And so it makes it seem very easy, and it could create, a different context than when we actually, kind of work our way into something, and as well as for the therapist. I can just, instead of have really become skillful, I can just have this person take this substance and they're wide open and I can work with them. And
yeah, and that is a big danger of psychedelics, that because it puts these managers to sleep or something, then you wind up going to places that they ordinarily are terrified to have you go. And when you come back, they could punish you for doing that in ways that can be quite serious. I learned the hard way about that with non-psychedelic IFS. And so that's why I was stressing earlier the importance of, in the prep sessions, getting permission from all these protectors, and even helping them become aware that we might go to these very scary places. And I just want to be sure that, I'll be with you the whole time and won't be judging you and all the things they're afraid of, but not going without permission. And that seems to the people like Sonny Strasberg and the people I collaborate with now have seen a big difference in the amount of what we call backlash that people suffer from because of that. And all this, we haven't even mentioned how many clinics there are out there where people give patients the medicine without even staying with them and staying in the room, and just kind of believe the medicine will do its magic. So for me, there's way too much focus on the medicine as the healer, rather than the medicine as a portal to healing. That needs a presence of a good therapist and somebody who knows the territory well.
Yeah, well, you brought up that risk of backlash from, parts that you brought into a situation maybe they weren't prepared for, they didn't give you permission for. To me, that one of the most obvious kind of evidence in my own experience of parts is like in oneself and others, when you see this kind of self-sabotage dynamic happen, where somebody's obviously doing something that's completely counterproductive to everything about their life. I mean, literally, burning their own life down and on one level or another, or at least undermining a relationship, or really, and who would do that to who? I mean, it really points that there's something going on here. There's some complexity of relationships going on there. Yeah,
but if if that was happening and I had you focus on that part that's trying to sabotage and got you curious about it, they generally have pretty good reasons. They're afraid if they don't pull you back down that you're going to take a lot of risks and get hurt again, and they're stuck in the past when that happened. And so, again, in contrast to other models that don't understand why someone would sabotage themselves, we always find there are good reasons. Not good reasons necessarily in the present, but there were good reasons in the past.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you very much. This has been incredibly rich journey. And every time I talk to you about this, I think I understand internal family systems better. And I think I understand myself a little better. And there really does just seem to be great promise here if we can sort of guide it with self-wisdom, this emergence of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and its potential integration with internal family systems. So thank you very much for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Fleet. As I said earlier, I always love talking to you. I always get a lot out of it too. And I'm so glad you're doing this because you're bringing a lot of wisdom to this community at this time, which is so important.
And people can find out more about your work at the IFS Institute. Is that what is it? IFS?
Institute.com. Yeah.
Right. IFS-institute.com, the IFS Institute. I encourage people to check that out. So thank you very much, Dr. Richard Schwartz, Dick Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Fleet. Great to see you.